For many of you watching out there, with so much going on in 2020, it might be easy to overlook the fact that this is still an election year. And as we've been covering, Democratic nominee Joe Biden has been able to be, expanding his lead right now in the polls over President Donald Trump. But a lot of questions are still being asked about where Joe Biden will land when it comes to that political spectrum, if he wants to play a little bit closer to the center or if he wants to shift farther to the left. And when we think about some of his policies, there's a lot to get into here. So I'm very happy to have back on the show former Democratic presidential candidate Marianne Williamson, also an author of A Politics of Love. And Marianne, thanks again for joining us. And I just want to kind of start with what we've seen out of the platform updates that we've gotten from Joe Biden, at least on the economic front. It seems like he's been adopting some of those ideas that you and others on the progressive left have championed when you think about the Green New Deal, some of those elements getting taken over in his Building Back Better program. So what's your take on what you've seen so far from Joe Biden's economic plans?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's always nice to see you. We aren't living in normal times. And so the normal conversation between what's on the left and what's on the right is not the dichotomy, not the contest, not the struggle that matters the most today. We're living at a time where this sort of golden mean of American politics, the kind of yin and yang between what's on the right and what's on the left, is not the deeper polarity. The deeper polarity is between forces of real democracy and forces of commitment to the traditions of American democracy versus an authoritarian takeover of sorts. So I think people of principle, whether they're on the left or on the right, know that there's an issue underlying all the social, economic, and political things that we normally associate with the issues. The deeper issue is breaking the free fall of American democracy. And that's why I believe a lot of people recognize in Joe Biden, look, he's not a conservative's dream candidate, and he's not a progressive's dream candidate. We all get that. But what he is someone that I think the majority of Americans realize represents a certain level of decency and a democratic norm for this country that we most desperately need.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because, as you're saying, I mean, obviously, these are some strange times we're operating in, but you were also pretty critical of your fellow Democratic candidates stacking up behind Biden, seemingly all at once to leapfrog what progress Bernie had staged on the campaign trail. You called it a coup, but since then we've seen him embrace some of the positions, as we talked about, those pieces of the Green New Deal, also his so-called caring economy pillars in universal pre-K. But you also have people mad that former Republican presidential candidate John Kasich will be speaking at the Democratic National Convention, a sign of how far to the center, I guess, Joe Biden might want to shift. So I asked this in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way, and to follow up on your point, in your eyes, is Joe Biden even running this as really establishing himself as a Democrat in your eyes?
I hope that Joe Biden realizes that the majority of Americans want Medicare for all. What too many corporate Democrats call this far left mentality is actually the center of where Americans are. You know, in the segments that you have been, that I've seen on your show in the last half an hour, we're talking about desperate times for a majority of Americans. We're talking about 7 million Americans who are on the verge of eviction crisis. We're talking about a lack of direct cash relief to people who desperately need it. We talk about rolling the dice with the safety of Americans' children in order to serve an economic paradigm that is becoming increasingly obsolete and unsustainable. So the idea of whether or not he's going to the left or going to the right, whether he's having John Kasich, you know, as someone who is on the left of the political spectrum, I'll tell you this. The fact that the Democratic Party, including Joe Biden, have drifted further to the right than I would wish, and that many of us would wish, are like two broken arms and two broken legs. The presidential agenda of Donald Trump, however, is like a bullet near the heart. So I'm very clear, and many Republicans and many Democrats are very clear that we have to take care of first things first. Once Biden is inaugurated, we can duke all of these things out. But right now we have an emergency on our hands, and that is breaking the free fall of our democratic freedoms.
In the context of first things first, I guess the next big decision that it'll have to make out there is choosing a vice presidential candidate here. And when you look at that front, what do you think might serve him best in, I guess, kind of bridging all of these constituencies that he's trying to serve? At what point? Who do you think out there right now should be his choice?
Joe Biden needs to listen to his heart. I would love to see Elizabeth Warren. because she represents the politics that I most admire. He has already said that he is choosing a woman. But I hope that on this and pretty much everything that Joe Biden does, that he will not be listening to focus groups. He will not be listening to strategists. He will be listening to the guidance of his own heart. We desperately need an American president who lives that way. And I hope that that will begin with his choice of vice president.
When we look at right now, too, I just want to get this in here as you talk about kind of some of the changing discussions that are being played out right now in America, not just because it's an election year, but because a lot's been happening in 2020. One of the key points that you recently penned an op-ed on has to do with reparations. In Newsweek, you wrote a few interesting things. I just want to read one of the quotes from that on the topic and why you say it's important for America to come out and actually provide reparations for African Americans here. You say, quote, "If you've been kicking people to the ground for centuries, you owe more to them than merely to stop kicking. You owe it to them to help them get back up." Pretty powerful stuff there. I mean, interestingly, a new poll from Washington Post and ABC News points out that about 2/3 of Americans oppose the payment of reparations compared to 31% who favor such payments. So when we look at that, I guess, why would it be better to provide reparations than it might be to bolster some of these economic programs out there that tend to help some of these communities of colors, not just Black people, but also Hispanics as well here, rather than reparations? Maybe try and put those in context.
Two things. First of all, what you refer to are race-based policies, but race-based policies are distinctly different than reparations in that reparations carry moral authority. Reparations carry an inherent mea culpa. Reparations carry an inherent acknowledgement of a wrong that was done, of a debt that is owed, and the willingness on the part of people to pay it. You know, when I was campaigning, one of the things I came to believe very strongly is that the average American is not a racist, but I do believe that the average American is deeply uninformed and uneducated about the history of race in the United States. And what I would find on the campaign is when I would give a little 5-minute thumbnail sketch, 1619, the first slaves brought over, slavery not abolished for 2.5 centuries, 4 to 5 million formerly enslaved people present at that time, all promised by Northern generals that they would receive for every former slave family of 4, 40 acres and a mule. The fact that that was followed, except for 12 years of Reconstruction, by another 100 years of institutionalized violence in the form of segregation, finally ending with the Civil Rights Act, the dismantling of segregation and the Voting Rights Act, but still leaving a gaping hole, a gaping economic disparity that needs to be addressed no differently than Germany addressed Jewish organizations with $89 billion of reparations at the end of World War II. This doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen, but it's gone far towards psychological and emotional as well as economic repair. And we need that in this country. We need psychological and emotional and moral repair as much as we need economic repair. And I believe that many Americans that I have spoken to who didn't understand that that's really what reparations stood for until they heard that argument, at the end go, oh, of course, now I understand.
Yeah, and that is kind of the interesting thing, too. Even though we did, as I just read, it seems the majority are opposed to economic reparations for African Americans. It does seem like the conversation has shifted way more in terms of understanding when we see the polling there, a lot more admitting that there does seem to be racist undertones, at least here, still in this country. So that is something important to raise there. But Marianne Williamson, appreciate you taking the time, as always, to chat with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.